The church branded its slaves with its own name. What would the world be without black people? Well, the Church of England would have had to find somebody else's chest to burn its name into. Branding a person takes more than an iron. It takes a fire and somebody to keep it lit. It takes hands more than one pair because a body does not hold still for that. And it takes a decision made in advance, in a room, by people who are calm, because somebody has to choose what the mark will say. They chose a whole word, not initials, not a symbol. A word burned across the chest above the heart, deep enough to scar so that if the person wearing it ever ran, the owner could prove the body was his. The word was society. The owner was a missionary organization. Its president was the Archbishop of Canterbury. They came to save souls. They showed up with a branding iron. If nobody taught you that, do not feel bad. That was on purpose. Subscribe and share Way Blackwin for more buried stories they tried to erase. The men who owned him ran the mission to save him. The Society for the Propagation of the Gospel in Foreign Parts was chartered in 1701. Its entire reason for existing was to carry Christianity across the empire. Archbishops of Canterbury led it. Bishops of London sat on it. Archbishops of York were involved in it. In 1710, it inherited 2 sugar estates in Barbados, roughly 763 acres in the parish of St. John, and 315 enslaved Africans listed the way you list livestock and cane presses. It did not sell them, it did not free them, it ran the estate, it appointed the attorneys, it read the accounts, it kept the books, for 126 years. Every Sunday for a century and a quarter, the same institution stood in pulpits across England and preached that every soul is equal in the sight of God, while several hundred of those equal souls were cutting its cane in Barbados, with its name burned into their skin. The baptism vow made you swear off your own freedom. This is the part that should stop you. The society did eventually offer baptism. It came with a condition written into the ceremony itself. Before receiving the sacrament, an enslaved convert had to stand up and declare that they did not ask for the holy baptism out of any design to free yourself from the duty and obedience you owe to your master. Read it again slowly. To be allowed near God, you first had to say out loud in front of the people who owned you that you were not trying to get free. They put a disclaimer on grace. Think about what that requires. Somebody drafted that sentence. Somebody approved it. Somebody read it aloud at the front of a room, looked into the face of a person they had branded, and waited for them to repeat it back. Sanctuary is the oldest promise the church makes. On this estate, it was the one thing that was never available. 16 years. Not one soul saved. Here is where the whole justification collapses. The argument for all of it, the argument every slave-holding Christian in the Atlantic world leaned on, was that bondage was the price of salvation. Bring them over, work them, but save them. That was the trade. The society did not honor its side of it. By 1726, 16 years into ownership, not one enslaved person on the Codrington estates had been baptized. 16 years, hundreds of people. 0. The organization whose only stated purpose on earth was saving souls owned several hundred souls outright and did not get around to a single one of them for 16 years. They were not even doing the thing they said the slavery was for. The bishop who wrote the loophole also read out the prophets. In 1711, 1 year into ownership, William Fleetwood, Bishop of St. Asaph, delivered the society's annual sermon and settled the legal question before anybody could raise it. His position, in his own words, was that if enslaved people could be sold before they were baptized, the laws of Christ would not deprive the owners of that property after baptism. Baptism was not a door, it was a lock with a cross on it. And in the same sermon, from the same pulpit in the same breath, he reported the yield. The Codrington estates were producing upwards of £2,000 per annum, clear of all charges. Clear of all charges, the charges were people. Christopher Codrington, who left the estates to the society when he died in 1710, had been specific about the arrangement. The plantations were to keep 300 Negros at least kept always thereon, so the profits could fund scholars living under vows of poverty, chastity, and obedience. Vows of poverty, funded by sugar. Somebody had to cut the sugar. The same will send £10,000 and 12,000 books to All Souls College, Oxford, to build a library. Oxford got the books. The church got the bodies. Both bequests came out of the same fortune, and only one of them was expected to bleed for it. 4 in 10 dead within 3 years. Barbados Sugar did not employ people, it went through them. Of every 10 enslaved people the society purchased in 1740, 4 were dead inside 3 years. A contemporary observation in 1746 put it at roughly 1/3 of all Africans arriving in the West Indies dead within 3 years of landing. So the society bought more. USBG, the organization the SBG became, now estimates that between 190 and 440 people work the estate at any one time, and that somewhere between 600 and 1,200 human beings lived and died there under church ownership. Sit with the distance between those two numbers. To keep a few hundred people standing in a field, the church buried more than 1,000. That is not a tragedy that happened to the operation. That is the operation, and the whip stayed. By USBG's own account, the whip in the field was not abolished on the estate until September 1829. 119 years in. 19 years into the century of the abolitionists, on land owned by the Church of England, a man could still be beaten in a field for working too slowly. They had a word for it. They wrote it down. They filed it. A letter dated 25 April 1741, now held at Lambeth Palace Library, describes the cruelty of his unchristian treatment of their unhappy slaves. Unchristian, not illegal, not unacceptable, not a matter for the courts. The strongest word that institution had in its vocabulary, the word that means you have violated the thing we exist for, applied by the church to conduct on the church's own plantation. They knew, they named it. They wrote it on paper in the sharpest language available to them. Then they put it in a drawer and kept the estate for another 97 years. Bishops read the mail. On 21 December 1733, Edmund Gibson, Bishop of London, sat down with correspondence from the Attorney General of Barbados about arrears on the colony's tax on enslaved people. A bishop going through a tax bill on human beings. Nobody can call this a dormant endowment ticking over in a ledger nobody opened. The mail came. The mail was read. The mail was answered. There was a man in a mitre keeping track of what the Crown charged him per head. The school they built and could not enter. In 1745, the Prophets opened a school on the grounds. Codrington College, funded by the sugar. Raised on the labor, white boys only. They cut the cane that paid the masons. They carried the stone. Their children could not walk through the door, warned from their own pulpit in 1783. Kept it 55 more years. Bailby Porteous, then Bishop of Chester and later Bishop of London, preached the Society's anniversary sermon at St. Mary-le-Bow and told that room to its face that it owed the people it owned greater humanity and tenderness than is commonly practiced by planters. He pushed the church to get out of the slave trade entirely. They heard him. The standard he asked for was never implemented, which kills the last defense anybody offers for this. Nobody gets to say they were a product of their time. Their time walked into their building, stood at their pulpit, wore their robes, and told them to stop. They kept the estate for another 55 years. 1816, somebody on the island could read. Barbados was never quiet. The island rose in what is remembered as Buss's Rebellion, the largest enslaved uprising in Barbadian history. Among the figures recorded in it is Nanny Grigg, an enslaved domestic worker who could read, who followed newspaper coverage of the debates in England about a slave registry, and who worked out from the planters' own panic that freedom was coming. She was right about the direction. She was early about the date. The uprising was crushed. Hundreds were killed. The plantations went back to work. The church's estate went back to work, 410 people. 8,558 £2 is 2d, paid to the church. In 1834, Britain abolished slavery and paid compensation, not to the people who had been enslaved, to the people who had owned them. £20 million of public money, the largest payout in British government history to that point, handed to slaveholders for the loss of their property. The Society filed a claim. The paperwork survives, catalogued by University College London's Legacies of British Slavery Database as Barbados Claim 4215. Claimant: the Honourable Reverend Society for the Propagation of the Gospel in Foreign Parts. Filed 9 May 1836. Treasurer of Record, James Haywood Markland. Number of human beings, 410. Award, 8,558 £2 is 2d. USBG's own account of the same settlement cites £8,823. Argue over the shillings if you want. The number that matters is the one that never appears on the form. The people received nothing. No land. No wages. No back pay for 126 years. What they got was a word, apprenticeship. It meant continuing to work for their former owners without pay, and on the Codrington estates it ran until 1838. The church had already been paid. They were still cutting cane. The counting had been running long before the money arrived. The UCL database preserves the Barbados slave registers for the college estate at Codrington under the Society's trustees. 119 people in 1817, 130 in 1823, 140 in 1826, 149 in 1829, 152 in 1832. Names entered, ages entered, increases and decreases logged. Decreases, that is where a death went. Somebody sat down with a pen, moved a human being from one column to another, and posted the page to an organization run by the Archbishop of Canterbury. The apology took until 2006. The society held the estates until 1983, when stewardship passed to the Codrington Trust. The school that opened for white boys in 1745 became an Anglican theological college by 1830 and stands today as the seminary that trains clergy across the Caribbean. Black priests now study on ground bought with the bodies of black people the church branded. At Oxford, All Souls kept calling its library the Codrington Library until 2020, when the college stopped using the name. The statue of Christopher Codrington stayed in the middle of the room. The college committed £100,000 to Codrington College in Barbados, endowed £6 million for the Hugh Springer Scholarships funding graduate studentships for Caribbean nationals of black or mixed black heritage, and in 2021 pledged £1 million over 10 years to Oxford's Black Academic Futures program. In February 2006, the General Synod voted unanimously to apologize. Archbishop of Canterbury Rowan Williams told the Synod the Church had to own its corporate and ancestral guilt, and that the body of Christ shares the shame and the sinfulness of our predecessors. In 2023, the Church Commissioners announced a £100 million fund for healing, repair, and justice, running from 2023 to 2031, after researchers traced Queen Anne's bounty to £13,907 of South Sea Company shares purchased in April 1720. In 2024, the Independent Oversight Group told the Church that £100 million was not enough and recommended the effort grow toward £1 billion. USBG pledged 18 million Barbadian dollars, around £7 million, over 10 to 15 years starting in autumn 2024, and said it is deeply ashamed of its past. So the Church of England has now issued 2 documents about these people, a receipt in 1836 and an apology in 2006, 170 years apart. Only one of them came with money attached, and it went the wrong way. What would the world be without black people? There would be no Codrington College, no library at All Souls in the shape it stands. No £2,000 a year, clear of all charges, running out of Barbados into English missionary work for over a century. The Church of England's reach across the 18th century world was financed, in part, by people it owned, whipped, and marked with a hot iron. And there would be no theology to argue with either. The doctrine that baptism does not free you was not invented in a vacuum. It was written because black people kept asking the obvious question, and asking it in a way that could not be ignored. If I am now your brother in Christ, why am I still your property? Fleetwood answered that in 1711, the way an institution answers when the honest answer costs money. Every argument running right now about reparations, about restitution, about whether sorry means anything without a number behind it is an argument those people started. They asked it first, in a chapel, with a brand on their chest. One more thing about the word. Of every word in the English language, they picked that one. Society, as in civilization, as in the thing they said they were bringing. They burned their own alibi into the skin of the people it was an alibi for. They wrote the crime directly onto the evidence, and then spent 300 years hoping nobody would read it. Somebody read it.